Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. What we have here today is a mini Phalaenopsis orchid. For some reason over the years, because this one originally was a no ID, but I kind of gave it a nickname and it has become the mini purple in my collection because it's a purple color and it's mini Phalaenopsis, so I call it mini purple. So this is the second time that it bloomed under my care, but let's go back in time to take a quick look at how it did last year in 2018, and then we can do a better comparison on how it does this year. So just really quickly, last year it did bloom, and the bloom count, the flower count, was pretty comparable to this year's bloom count. I think it's like 8 or 9 blooms. I didn't really count them. I forgot to count them. But as you can see here, I think it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7, 8. So comparable, but last year's bloom were smaller. And they just don't look as full. I think the space between the flowers are is slightly bigger. And this year, it does look a little more full. This orchid isn't fragrant to begin with, but the color itself is a really saturated purple-ish fuchsia color, which I adore. And this orchid is one of the first few orchids that I purchased when I was still living in New York. So this is one of the pioneers, I guess, one of the first few orchids in my collection. And to be honest with you, if you go back to the very beginning of my channel history, you know, this is one of the few orchids that pretty much got me restarted with my orchid journey, because I was living in Asia for some time and coming back to America. Obviously I couldn't take any plant with me, so I really had to restart collecting orchids and restart with my collections here. And I try not to think about potentially relocation across countries, because that would also means I'll have to get rid of these orchids and start afresh. I try not to think about that, but there's also a possibility, so we don't know what's gonna happen, but that's beside the point. Okay, so pretty soon, now let's look at some of the photos and videos from this year, from 2019. So this orchid was, doing pretty well. I potted this orchid in a clay pot, and at the time I was doing some kind of experiment on media ratio. So I think it was 40% moss and 60% lava rock. I remember it was a 40-60. And here, just to give you a timestamp, the first flower opened around mid-March 2019. Obviously, before then, it was growing a spike and buds. It was end of 2018 that it started putting out a spike, and then it took its sweet time, 2 to 3 months to grow buds, and then mid-March was when it started to open its first bloom. Anyway, back to the media. The media is 40% moss, 60% lava rock in a clay pot. And it seems to be working pretty okay, because this orchid really just kept growing leaves and root production. Based on what I can see from the top, it's doing pretty well. And last year it bloomed, this year it bloomed, and I think this year's bloom look fuller. So I think this orchid is relatively healthy. But at some point, I really do have to look at the overall history and decide if it's time for a repot, because last year I already talked about trying to repot, but because timing wasn't right, so I didn't do it. This year I didn't do it again, but thankfully right now, as I do this video narration, this video is around July 2019. But I don't know, no guarantee I'm gonna be publishing this video in July. It depends on my work and my bandwidth. So just to give you a reference, mid July 2019, this orchid is still potted in the clay container and the regional media. But overall, I think this orchid is doing good. Every time I give it water, it's quarter strength, so 25% strength fertilizer, and the outer cup, the transparent plastic cup that you see, is the cup that I use to collect any water that come out of the bottom drainage hole. How I water this orchid is I would fill the water from the top of the media and just filling it with relatively fast speed. So once the water reaches the edge of the clay pot, I stopped, and then the water gradually goes down and will be collected by the plastic cup, and that's how I just let it sit for 20, 30, sometimes up to an hour as I do other stuff around the house. And then when I remember, I would then drain, all these orchids together. That's what I do with this orchid for in terms of watering and the care. There isn't really anything too different or too special that I'm doing for this orchid. So it's a mini that's just really low maintenance, and it's a grocery store Phal, right? It's a grocery store Phal, so it's less than $10 US. So the fact that it's producing blooms 2 years in a row, I think it's relatively inexpensive, and it's a really good experience. So far, this mini purple has exceeded my expectation on many fronts. For summertime in my environment, typically I give this orchid water with fertilizer every 7 days or so. But sometimes I do have to travel for business, and sometimes I am busy with other stuff, so I don't always get to water them every 7 days. So sometimes I go up to 10 days, and it would still be okay. And for winter time, usually the cycle is about 2 weeks, but I have gone for almost 3 weeks and come back home, and they still did okay. So that's kind of the time frame in my environment for your reference. Now let's move forward. End of April 2019, it started to put out another bud at the very end of its flower spike, and this is after it had bloomed out all its bud. It started to grow that one tiny little bud, and then a month later, end of May 2019, that flower also opened. So this year, what this orchid has done differently was it grew an extra bud, and this bud actually grew to open. That's right. So I was really, really happy, because typically the last bud don't always get to develop full leaves. They would just become yellow and eventually drop. So this orchid this year really has exceeded my expectation. And also, like I said earlier, the bloom count, comparable, but the bloom size, it just looks fuller. And it may have to do with the fact that this orchid maybe is more mature, or maybe because the way that I provide fertilizer and care and some neglect from time to time somehow reach that sweet spot, the optimal sweet spot for this orchid to bloom the way that it has for this year, and also open, mature this bud, this flower, and open. So overall, I really enjoy this bloom season of this orchid, the bloom season of this orchid, because it's also pretty relatively long lasting. It was in bloom for almost 2 months in my environment. I actually took this orchid to my office, and it stayed in my office until all the blooms had dropped. And altogether, from when it first opened its flower to the last flower dropped, it's well beyond 2 months. And before we finish the video, there's been something that some Western orchid hobbyists have been discussing with me, and then they're saying that mini Phalaenopsis orchids actually require more water than, say, mid-size or regular large-size Phalaenopsis orchid, which I think it makes sense, because when it blooms, if you look at the overall area of the flower, it's significantly proportionally larger than, say, the bloom area of a big Phalaenopsis orchid, which have much bigger leaves. Right now, if you look at this orchid, the ratio is like maybe 2 part leaf and 1 part flower, right? And the flower tissue requires water when it's in bloom. But then if you look at bigger Phalaenopsis orchid, the leaves are much larger, and in comparison, the ratio of the flower petal, the flower itself, probably is a lot less than mini Phalaenopsis orchid. And maybe that's why when mini Phalaenopsis orchid is developing spikes or blooming, it actually loves more water than mid-size or larger Phalaenopsis orchid would. Just something I throw out here for you to think about. I don't know the correct answer, but I think it makes sense to me. What do you think? This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!